that's how he always frames this, as there are these no-brainer policies that if the US just imposed, all of the pain would be borne by others and all of the benefits would accrue to the US. And that's never how trade policy works. You're always choosing between competing domestic interests.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. If Donald Trump actually follows through on many of his campaign promises around imposing tariffs, it would thoroughly upend the rules-based system governing international trade. That system, which is in part embodied by the World Trade Organization, was at one time championed by the United States. But over the years, U.S. presidents, including President Biden, have sometimes skirted its rules and processes. However, the incoming Trump administration seems willing to ignore it altogether. So what does this mean for global trade, and could Trump's actions spark a trade war? Joining me to answer these questions and more is Dmitry Grozoubinski, a trade expert and author of the new book, Why Politicians Lie About Trade and What to Do About It. We kick off discussing the book before having a long conversation about how Trump's approach to international trade upends the logic of the rules-based trading system and whether or not his policies may lead to a trade war. I'll post a link to the book in the show notes of this episode. I learned a lot from this book, and I do recommend, if you are interested in learning more about how trade works, that you purchase the book. It was really, really helpful to me personally. As always, feel free to reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org to let me know if you have suggestions of people I should interview or topics I should cover. And while you're there, of course, you can sign up for our newsletter, and you can also make an ongoing contribution to this show. Thank you. All right, now here is my conversation with Dmitry Grozoubinski, author of the book, Why Politicians Lie About Trade. So, Dmitry, I wanted to take a moment right off the bat to plug your book. It offers a really accessible explanation of the policies and politics of international trade. And on like a personal level, it filled a lot of the holes of my own understanding of trade issues. So thank you. I just wanted to ask you off the bat, though, the question around which you frame your book: why do politicians lie about trade?
So I think the book is far less polemical than the title. So I think a lot of people see that title and imagine that it is basically just me refighting every Twitter spat I've ever had with a politician to the tune of, 300 pages. And that's not at all what I was trying to do. I think politicians lie about trade for a couple of reasons. I think first and foremost, they do it because it's easy. Politicians are inherently about messaging. They are trying to tell a story about the kind of choices they are making or would make if they were in power. And the way that trade works, the fact that it's often counterintuitive, the fact that it's about locals and foreigners, the fact that most people don't really know how it works, makes it very easy to tell a story about how it is in actuality not a trade-off at all when you're making policy, that there are things that you can do with trade that will have no losers at all in your own country. And that's not at all how things work, but it's an appealing story for a certain type of politician. And I think for others, those politicians who are operating entirely in good faith, they are often, when confronted with that kind of story being told by the opposition and knowing they only have a soundbite or two in which to punch back, they are forced to then curate their own message and adopt some of those tactics just to remain competitive. If somebody is throwing punchy catchphrases at you and you only have 10 seconds to respond, you're going to do what you're going to do. So I think those are the primary reasons that it happens. And rather than trying to sort of attack them for it too much, I try to explain what's really going on with trade and the sort of questions that you should be asking both as journalists, but as sort of consumers of policy discussions to try to get a little bit further than that surface level soundbite.
And let me just reiterate, your book is very explanatory in tone and not polemical in tone. And for that, just thank you. I did learn a lot. You mentioned just now that a certain type of politician is prone to lie about trade. I just want to address the elephant in the room right now, the incoming US president, Donald Trump. How would you characterize how he lies about trade?
Instinctively and very, very easily. His lies about trade fall into a couple of buckets. So, first of all, as with a lot of his politics, frankly, and his rhetoric, there's a strong element of grievance to it. There is this whole framework that the entire system which the US built is somehow screwing the US, that it's all rigged against the US worker, the US business, and so on. And look, international fairness is a complicated question, but I always say, the US is like the richest country and the most powerful country in the history of the world. And so for me, it's a little bit difficult to see how badly could trade really be doing over the US given its dominant position. So that's kind of bucket one. There's a second bucket in which I think he massively undersells the trade-offs involved. This idea that, foreigners will pay the tariffs. That's how he always frames this, as there are these no-brainer policies that if the US just imposed, all of the pain would be borne by others and all of the benefits would accrue to the US. And that's never how trade policy works. You're always choosing between competing domestic interests, first and foremost. And it's never so simple as simply outsourcing all of the pain to somebody else. And then I also think he fundamentally misrepresents what the modern US economy is. And he's far from the only one who's guilty of this. But a very, very small percentage of the US public works in a factory or ever wants to work in a factory. From listening to him, you would think that, 70% of American adults are clocking into work assembling vehicles or building ships. And so any policy that gets them higher wages or gets more of them into work is worth any price. And that's simply not how the modern US economy works. And so to the extent that he ever does present these choices between what can we do to help manufacturing and what are we willing to pay for it, he massively misrepresents that the pain of his policies will be borne by everyone. And even if they all work exactly as he'd hope, the benefits will flow to a relatively small part of the population.
So within week of becoming reelected, Trump announced this whopping 25% tariff that he intends to impose on imports from Canada and Mexico. What do you suppose drove that decision? It's eye-popping. These are three economies, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, are so deeply intertwined at the moment.
So I think there are a couple of things driving that. For Donald Trump, one of the biggest appeals of tariffs is that they are something that he feels he, as the executive, has the power to impose or take away. And secondly, that he views them as a bargaining chip. Fundamentally, and you can put a negative spin on this and say it's a mafia style extortion, or you can put a much more neutral spin on it and say that this is simply sort of smart international relations strategic play. He says, listen, we have something other countries want, which is the ability to sell to US consumers. That gives us leverage. My administration has a range of priorities that we need other countries to do things in order to attain. And I'm going to put those two things together. And so he makes this threat, and what immediately happens? The Mexican president gets on the phone, the Canadian prime minister gets on a plane. And for him, there's this sort of sense of, hey, I have this gigantic stick that I can at least shake and rattle menacingly whenever I want without Congress. And every time I do it, the stick is so scary, people come to the negotiating table with me. You can understand that appeal from his perspective.
It's also one of those things, at least from having, lived through the first Trump administration here in the United States, that oftentimes he says things but doesn't follow through. And he's so mercurial and temperamental that it's hard to judge whether or not these threats really have any teeth.
So this is a real challenge for business for commentators, because the fact that he has some of these things within his power means that just by announcing them, by putting out that balloon, he already triggers a reaction, right? And so with Canada and Mexico, is he ever really going to impose those tariffs? Maybe not, but just the fact that he might, and the Mexicans and Canadians clearly think he might, is worth the start of a negotiation and is worth at least symbolic or the appearance of concessions. And so one of the challenges facing the business community, facing everybody really, is when he truth socials or tweets an idea that we all look at and go, well, hold on, this seems a little bit self-destructive. Surely he'll never do this. The question for all of us is, do we freak out and risk looking silly when he doesn't do it, or risk having wasted our emotional energy when he doesn't roll it out? Or is the reason he's not rolling it out because we all freaked out and somebody he actually listens to got on the phone with him and said, hey, yeah, if you do this, it's going to cost thousands of American jobs because it'll break supply chains on the whole continent?
So, as we speak, the Trump administration is staffing up. What do some of these early staffing decisions suggest to you about how Trump might approach trade policy toward China?
There's a very smart piece by Alan Beatty in the Financial Times that basically strongly advises against attempting to draw any kind of inference about what's going to happen with trade policy from these kind of staffing decisions in the Trump White House now.
Huh. So it was a bad question I just asked you. No,
Well,
but
it's an obvious question, and I can
yeah.
see why people are asking it. I think Alan makes a strong case that, judging by the first Trump administration, the way that trade policy will be made vis-a-vis everything, I think, not just China, but sort of everything, will be this endless cavalcade of competing interests, like a court of St. James, courtiers and foreign dignitaries and company representatives all vying for influence. And so any attempt to construct a coherent narrative or sort of draw a kind of policy throughput from, like, the fact that, Bob Lighthizer didn't get a job, but his former deputy did, and that kind of stuff, you will end up giving yourself a headache and not necessarily learning too much. With that said, the US as a country clearly views China as an existential challenge to US dominance this century. That is about the only thing on which there is bipartisan agreement. Trump himself, this sort of sense of grievance, unfairness in a system that doesn't work for the US, really is built around China. And again, the actual economics of that are hideously complicated, but he clearly shares the broader US system's concern at least about Chinese competition. And so I think almost regardless of who he picks or is picking, I think we can expect a US administration that at least wants to be seen as taking it to China and using all manner of tools in the US arsenal to do it.
So I take your point that it's very difficult to discern what Trump might do in any given moment. And frankly, that's not just trade policy, it's many other policy sectors. But trade policy really does seem to be what animates him the most, at least internationally. It's kind of immigration, migration policy here in the United States. But trade policy is really what seems to get him up in the morning and get to work. That said, I think it's probably fair to speculate, at least, that the Trump administration poses a real, like, extreme threat, potentially at least, to like the rules-based system embodied by the World Trade Organization of like that liberal rules-based order of international trade. Before we get into the potential threats that the incoming administration might pose to that system, could I just have you explain the logic of that system in the first place and how it came into being and why it came into being?
I can give it a go. Please keep in mind I'm not a trade historian, but I'll try to provide a really truncated, simplified version. After World War II, the Allied powers looked at a Europe that was in rubble, completely destroyed, and needed to be rebuilt. They also looked at a recent history where during and right before the Great Depression, countries had attempted to deal with high unemployment and inflation by raising trade barriers on one another in an endless escalation to try to bring jobs back home without a lot of success. And so they looked at those two things and they said, okay, what do we need to do in order to rebuild Europe? We need to give capital, private money, business the confidence that they can make long multi-year investments in Europe and around the world. We need to give them the confidence that if they build a factory in France that may not sort of pay for itself for a decade, that we as governments are not going to raise barriers and play with border settings over and over in ways that will compromise that factory's ability to either get what it needs or to sell what it makes across borders. They also knew that there would always be a temptation upon themselves and then on future leaders to reach for that tariff toolbox whenever the economy is shaky or someone just needs a populist talking point. So they put all of that together and they said, what we can do is exchange some binding promises between us through international treaties where we will put in place rules that prevent our worst impulses on this. They will make it harder to constantly play with tariffs, to discriminate between different trading partners, to use tariffs as a tool of bilateral diplomacy. And by doing that, we can provide stability and predictability to investors and to those who are sort of planning supply chains that were increasingly regional and global. That is, to kind of zoom out a million miles, that is the logic of the system. It is governments giving away the ability to do things that they might want to do with their policy settings at the border in exchange for everyone else doing the same. And that kind of system providing predictability and stability for business to make long-term global investments that stimulate growth.
And as you alluded to earlier, the advent of this system coincided with the American century, and the United States still, sits on top of this system as the world's most powerful, largest economy. But I do wonder if a U.S. trade policy that is unmoored from that system might cause its potential dissolution and what that would mean for the United States, but also for the rest of the world.
So, first of all, I think there is a broader trend at play here, and the US is obviously the beacon of Gondor everybody is looking at, understandably, because they are so large and so visibly extreme on this. But there has been a broader trend among many, many major capitals. So, this sort of very much includes Brussels and Beijing, I think, to look at that previous system that was all about stability and predictability for investment over other priorities, and to sort of say, well, actually, now we have priorities that increasingly we would weight as much or even more than that. So for Brussels, it's about environmental concerns and regulatory concerns and making sure that there is no sort of leakage, that EU environmental regulations aren't just driving companies away to places with lacks of regulation. For the US, its national security was a huge concern, but everybody is thinking about reindustrialization, how to combat populism, all sorts of other concerns that governments are saying, well, maybe we appreciate the stability that the system has brought to investment, but we now have things that we really want to do. And we think those are worth the damage that we will do to the system by ignoring or sidestepping its rules in order to implement them. So I think that is a broader policy. With that said, a US that flagrantly ignores the rules and begins to effectively weaponize its trade policy in unpredictable ways that run contrary to the rules and spirit of the organization will massively undermine the organization's effectiveness. There's no question about that, because countries will need to retaliate against the US, probably in ways that are contrary to WTO rules. And that every time that you have a large, flagrant violation of the rules by so visible a former champion and architect of them, it obviously just undermines the weighting that policymakers will give to international rules when considering a decision.
So, fascinatingly, you just used a couple of terms: weaponizing trade, retaliation. This suggests to me the prospect of a trade war. What would be like the venue or the theater of a potential trade war in the coming years? And more broadly, like, what are the dynamics of a trade war?
So I don't think there is a formal definition of trade war. You don't declare it as you do under, a real war under the Treaty of Westphalia, whatever. Basically, a trade war for me is when, instead of using trade tools to try to change a specific thing about what another country is doing, you start using trade instruments to just kind of cause them pain and damage for its own sake. So, for decades now, and entirely within the rules, a country is selling you steel at below the cost of production, it's dumping it on you. You levy tariffs against that steel to try to get them to stop and to keep them out of your market. That's not a trade war. A trade war is when you just attempt to cause them economic pain almost for its own sake, simply to weaken their economy. So I think it is fair to say, for example, that the West is trying to wage a trade war against the Russian Federation, mildly following Crimea, massively following the 2022 re-invasion of Ukraine, or doubling down on the invasion of Ukraine.
But Russia's ability to retaliate is limited, with the exception of energy exports.
Russia has certainly attempted to retaliate, in the sense that even after 2014, Russia effectively banned all EU fresh produce from Russia on absolutely invented health and safety grounds. So that was their attempt to retaliate against what the EU was doing. It is just that, firstly, the Russian market as a consumer market just wasn't that valuable. Secondly, the Russian border for this kind of thing was turned out to be pretty easily obviated, and just the size didn't balance out. If the US and China start swinging at each other, that's a completely different ballgame.
We've seen, elements of trade spats, I suppose, not in a full out war between the United States and China. I mean, I could only expect that tensions will be heightened and that there really is a prospect of a actual trade war between the United States and China. And if so, what would be the dynamics of that?
So, in some ways, this would, I think, mirror the actual kind of military dynamics here, too, in that both countries, I think, have tools that, if they used, could cause the other side a huge amount of damage. There are certain supply chains in which China is the only supplier of like the primary components. If they cut those off, it would seriously hurt the US. The US has a lot of tools to cut the Chinese off from, say, the SWIFT banking system, which would make it much, much harder to trade currency and cause significant problems for China. Those things are so extreme and so damaging to kind of everybody that there's a very good chance that unless something really, really extreme happens, for example, the Chinese government decides to completely blockade Taipei. If things go in that direction, all bets are off. No one knows. But short of something like that, what you're likely to see is, first of all, both sides looking at divestment from the other. So basically saying, what can we do with our policies to lessen that interdependence? How do we get the factories that we need to move out of China to other places? If you're the US, if you're the Chinese, you're saying, how do we replicate US systems? How do we make sure we're not dependent on US intellectual property and US know how? How do we make sure we have the chips that we need for our high end manufacturing and so on? So you're going to see a lot of kind of maneuvering kind of things as the two sides play against each other. You are also likely to see them swing at each other in ways that are politically impactful, but not always necessarily like objectively that damaging. So, to give you one example, the Chinese, when they were having a disagreement with Australia about a number of Australian policies, hit Australian wine and Australian wheat. Now, neither of those are the bedrock of the Australian economy, and exports to China of those things were not the bedrock of the Australian export market. But it hurt, and it hurt in regional constituencies that the Australian government felt pain over. What the Chinese didn't do was hit Australian coal and iron ore, because while that would have been a much more savage blow to the Australian economy, it also would have really hurt the Chinese economy to no longer be receiving those. So, what you're likely to see is both sides maneuvering around how to make sure that we bring the targeted industries that we want. How do we make sure that we're developing those in house? And secondly, looking for opportunities to do these kind of high profile, stinging blows to the other side as a way of trying to shape the other's politics.
Well, to that end, just looking ahead in the next few months as the Trump administration establishes itself in DC, are there any opening salvos of a potential trade spat that might not escalate into a full scale trade war that you may expect from the Trump administration? Or it's hard to predict anything from the Trump administration, but would suggest to you the trajectory of the Trump administration's policies on trade towards China?
So we've already seen, for example, the Trump administration begin to explore legislative action to include tariffs within like legislative packages. So that shows a degree of seriousness because it goes beyond sort of a thought bubble that is tweeted out on social media. It goes to the level of someone in Congress is putting some thought into this, and that is certainly a sign. I think, as you alluded to earlier, some of the staffing picks that have gone to real China hawks does not suggest a particularly dovish approach. So that's also something to think about. A lot of it will be about what happens on day one under the structure of US legislation and powers for the White House. Donald Trump can, by effectively executive order, impose quite severe tariffs on China should he choose to do so. He can also push for the withdrawal of what is known as most favored nation status from China, putting it in the same category as countries like Russia and Cuba, where the US is concerned, and allowing them to impose significantly higher barriers on China at the stroke of a pen. A lot of the tea leaves we'll have to read are about what does he do with the powers he already has, and what are the steps that he takes in order to provide himself even more sticks to swing in the near future.
Well, Dmitry, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll post a link to your excellent book in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.